Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's Fireside Chat. We are going to be talking all about the platformification of staffing. Now, before I dive into that, I want to share a few familiar faces with you. We've got Rowan Jacob, who's the CEO of Time Saved, as well as Danny Ashraf, director at Monster. I'll introduce them here in a moment, but what are we going to talk about with the platformification of staffing? First of all, we will define it. What does that mean? Then we'll talk about the trends in the industry, really among staffing agencies as well as platform players. We'll talk about how this whole concept really changes the experience for candidates, clients, and staffing firms on the recruiting side. And then, of course, the importance of technology adoption, the key elements to consider when buying versus building, and then a few really fun takeaways to keep in mind as you're evaluating your tech stack, your digital transformation, your all of the above for your staffing firm. So let's go ahead and dive in with a few quick bios and we'll get started. So Rowan Jacob, like I mentioned, he's the founder and CEO of SPAS, as in staffing platform as a company called Time Saved. So Time Saved is a staffing platform as a company. He's one of the industry's most prominent voices on the rise of the staffing platform technology. And you're probably pretty familiar with him because he speaks all over the place here in our industry around this particular topic. He also sits on the ASA Technology Task Force. And I have to say, I've come to discover that when he's not evangelizing digital transformation, he's biking, listening to podcasts, or spending a lot of time on Time Save's Pets channel on their Slack. So ask him about that later. And then Danny is the director of sales at Monster Worldwide, and he has spent the past 15 years helping staffing firms and their candidate supply challenges, which I know everybody has today. Outside of work, he enjoys all things espresso and red wine related, as we all, right? And so that brings it to me. If I'm a new face to you and you're coming across this Fireside Chat for the first time, my name is Kelly Schutrop. I'm with Parka. We're a performance marketing agency. I've spent the past 15 years focused on marketing, the last 11 of that specifically in the staffing space. So I nerd out about this. I sit on ASA's Women in Leadership Council and their marketing and PR committee. And I'm just here today to bring this really fun topic to you. So platformification of staffing. Danny, Rohan, thank you for joining me here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
We should start off with that definition, right? What is the platformification of staffing?
Please, why don't you go ahead and take it away? What does that mean?
Yeah. And Danny, feel free to jump in. I think this trend has been going on for probably a couple of decades, but it's really accelerated post-COVID. Previously, you probably were familiar with companies like Winolo and Blue Crew, these sort of niche vertical labor marketplaces. And they were essentially, if you think about the Uberization of staffing, they were the early players that tried to do it in that space. And there were a lot of players that jumped in, technology companies trying to figure out how do we essentially disintermediate or get rid of the staffing agency from the equation and go directly between clients and candidates. Sort of thinking about that Uber example, right? Like how do we take staffing that's this decades, it's been around for decades, hasn't really changed other than, we've always been emailing and calling candidates and clients. The biggest technology change has been adding texting. And so it wasn't really, a leap forward in tech. And so there were these players that were coming out that were essentially turning that experience into what we call a vertical marketplace. And today, what you're seeing post-COVID is the acceleration of that, and staffing agencies now trying to figure out how do they actually leverage some of these benefits? How do they adopt some of these technologies, these processes into their traditional staffing firm so that they can reap some of the benefits? And so that's what we're calling the platformification of staffing, is that convergence that's happening, whether it's a tech company that's trying to figure out staffing or a staffing company that's trying to figure out technology. They're essentially looking at changing the experience altogether and for all the stakeholders in that equation.
Yeah, and there's been a few companies that have done a really good job of this. I know we've got a visual. I'll go ahead and share it with the crew. If you follow SIA and you're a member there, this may be familiar to you. Rowan, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this slide came out at the recent exec forum conference that happened last month in Texas, and it's a healthcare platform. This is a healthcare staffing agency, Aya. They had actually built the tech prior to the pandemic, but then and we'll talk about this a little bit. One of the challenges is that just because you have the technology doesn't mean you're actually going to be able to use it. And that was certainly something that April talked about when she was talking about the results. She came up and she talked about how once they launched this platform in Q2 of 2020, they were at 7,500 nurses deployed. Fast forward to 2 years later, and they're almost at 50,000. So they just kept doubling and doubling and doubling until they hit this peak. And the key takeaway for staffing agencies is they didn't double by doubling their recruiter headcount. They doubled by leveraging technology, right? Oftentimes when staffing agencies in the past have thought about growth, that growth has been tied to, well, if I need to grow the people that I have deployed, I need to add recruiter headcount, I need to add operational headcount. And that was something that they showed was not actually true anymore. They were able to do it by leveraging platform technology, and they actually showed that the candidate experience improved at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely nuts. And obviously so much happened in that industry over the last couple of years that they would have seen growth anyway, but not at that level, to your point, without rapidly scaling their internal teams. And even hiring recruiters right now, there's a massive shortage of that and a massive need. So without that technology investment, which, we'll talk about the buy and build later in this conversation, it wouldn't have been possible.
Absolutely.
So, it's funny because that really brings us into the next point that we want to cover today, which is around those trends in the industry among staffing agencies and platform players. And Rowan, you've touched on this some, but Danny, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We joke internally here at Parka that when you order a pizza, in front of you, exactly what's happening. And down to the second when your pizza's in the oven. But when you go through a process as important as finding a new job, or if you're a recruiter trying to weed through all of the resumes, if you're working with more of a high volume approach, it's just never been simple. And it's starting to get there. So what are your thoughts on that, Danny?
Yeah, there's a joke in the industry, a good one or a bad one, I'm not sure, but they say that job boards, right, are a black hole, and sometimes staffing firms get their finger, pointed at them sometimes around that. So it's important to remember that, staffing firms aren't competing with other staffing firms only today. Right. Staffing firms have to think about the fact that they're competing with an experience that consumers have. And that experience could be from Amazon. It could be from Netflix. All of these technologies have one thing in common. They have an excellent consumer experience. Right. Somebody at Monster created this term called apply with thumb, right? If you can't apply with your thumb, you've lost the interest of a potential candidate. And it reminds me of a funny story I heard at a conference recently, and they shared that Amazon invented or patented one-click ordering in the 90s, which blew my mind. I know I shared that with you guys the other day. And their main competitor in the e-com space at the time was a company called Pets.com, which you've probably never heard of because they don't exist anymore. And their biggest competition with Pets.com was how fast could they get to a seamless ordering and checkout process. So Pets.com had a 3-click ordering process, and Amazon wanted to have a 1-click ordering process. And people thought, what's the big deal? Well, no one's heard of Pets.com. Everyone's heard of Amazon now. So that potentially insignificant change from 3 clicks to 1 click was a game changer from a technology perspective. So I think it's important to remember that, although Amazon wasn't competing against Pets.com from a selling pet food perspective, right, they were competing against them from a user experience perspective. So staffing firms need to remember they're not competing against each other. They're also competing against everyone that has a mobile or a digital type of experience. So they really need to start thinking like technology companies, or thinking technology first, not thinking like a traditional staffing organization. Because what got you to your first 10 million in revenue or 20 million in revenue is not the same strategy that's going to get you to the next 20 million or 100 million or $1 billion in revenue. And I think Aya is a great case study of that. Now, over the past couple of years, where other companies really struggled, I I don't even know what the multiple was in revenue.
Right.
Increased by. So that's a great case study in itself. The difference between embracing technology or shying away from it.
No, it's so true. And really, this changes everything for the candidates, for the clients, and for recruiters. And we have a client who, just like you've both touched on, they've been able to scale their revenue, not by hiring additional recruiters, but by investing in technology and literally having conversations with recruiters whose companies are investing in technology. It's a game changer for them, because all of a sudden, the recruiter makes this much money because they have this many consultants out in the field. And if they want to make twice the amount of money, they're going to have to put out twice the amount of consultants in the field, which equates to, you could assume twice the amount of emails sent, interviews, texts, all the things. But by investing in these automation platforms and just different components that allow it to speak together seamlessly, they're now making more money and not burning themselves out, which actually is a really good advocacy point for recruiter retention. Everybody thinks about technology like, well, it's an investment so that we can get more clients. It's an investment so we can retain our candidate, population, all of those things. But it's actually like recruiters are the number one job right now on LinkedIn that's in demand. And if you create an environment that a recruiter would be like, man, I do not want to leave this. Like I'm getting support. It becomes sticky for your internal team too.
Totally. Another quote that I wanted to mention, I thought that was funny. The CIO of a staffing firm sat down with me a few weeks ago and said, we all suffer from the disease of we've always done it this way. So we have to remember that, again, what got you to your first X million in revenue is not going to get you to the next, but it's really hard to get through that change management mindset and to take the step into even researching staffing platforms and a digital approach to staffing. So I thought that was really funny. I've never heard anyone refer to the lack of change as a disease. So,
right. Yeah,
it's really important. Like that organization, I'm going to guess if they had a CIO, they're a relatively large staffing agency. And for a lot of, when you look at the industry, the staffing industry, it's no secret that the majority of staffing agencies aren't the very large players.
Right.
But they can certainly take their cues, because, the smaller agencies actually have it easier when it comes to that change management, to be able to do it. To be able to turn a large organization is so much more challenging. And again, when you look at someone like Aya, that's where what they did was just that much more impressive. They were already $1 billion agency, and then to go from $1 billion to $5 billion in 2 years as a result of being able to leverage this sort of platform is just, a shining example of how to do it really well.
Just the evolution of technology adoption in staffing blows my mind. Like I've been, in this space for the last over 10 years. You guys have been in it for just as long and longer. And, you think about the table stakes before, where you have to have a website. Of course you have an ATS, but at one point, those were not the table stakes. At one point, those were the early adopters starting to check those things out and invest in those technologies. And now, you'd be really hard pressed to find any company in this space without that and without multiple iterations invested in that. And where would you guys say, this is just subjective, right? Like if you think about that curve, like the early adopters, like the large middle where everybody's implementing, and then the late adopters, I'm curious where you think the majority of the industry is when it comes to just kind of the platformification of staffing, like automating pieces, making them work together.
I've got my thoughts, Danny, if you want to share yours.
No, fire away.
These two are so polite, you guys. I Go ahead, Rowan.
Yeah, I think we're still we're not in the early adopter phase anymore. I think we're past that now. We're now in the early majority. And again, this comes in research from SIA, right? Obviously, as a founder of a company that is building this kind of technology, something like this is very near and dear to me, because I'm always trying to figure out when is that peak going to come that people actually, it's no longer something that is a nice to have, but it's something that you absolutely need to have. And SIA, at the same conference revealed that 37% of staffing agency owners are looking to adopt this technology over the next 2 years, meaning they're already in that process, right? They've gone through their planning meetings with their boards, and they've recognized that. And so when you look at, are we at the innovators phase where it's those really, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, those very early players that were just sort of testing the waters and trying to see different things? We're definitely not there. We're not in the early adopter phase anymore, because again, you've got players, large players that are showing this. It's not just in the healthcare space. You've got it happening in the light industrial space and the commercial space as well. But I also don't think we're quite in the late majority or the laggards just yet. Certainly by the end of this year and this time next year, we'll probably have crossed that chasm. But my take is that we're in that early majority. So if you're looking at that bell curve, just before we hit the peak.
Yeah, I would say over the past 2 years, there's been an expansion, right, in the number of players in the space. Rohan would probably know better than I do. There's 5 to start out, and now there's 50 or 100. And the good news about that is it's more accessible, the technology, right, to small and medium-sized organizations. When this concept of digital staffing or staffing platforms as a service came about a couple of years ago, it was mainly built for the medium to large to enterprise organizations. Those are the target clients, or it was these larger organizations building it on their own. And they had internal development teams and, large amounts of resources to put towards stuff like that. So I think that technology has gotten to a point now where it's becoming more accessible, right? You think of the invention of the cell phone and how I remember when I was in 7th grade, I was the only kid in my class whose family had a cell phone. And it was this big James Bond Ericsson cell phone, and you could play Snake on it. And that was the coolest thing in the world. And 2 years later, everyone had a Motorola StarTAC flip phone. So in that short time frame, it went from being a business tool that I stole from my mom probably to a technology that all middle schoolers and high schoolers had. So I think we're at that point now where there's available options for all shapes and sizes of staffing firms.
Yeah, right. And speaking of building out, Danny, you've got a fun kitchen remodel going on, right? So you're investing in your house.
Maybe you can hear that in the background.
Honestly, though, it's not a bad analogy. Everybody thinks about maintenance in every other area of their life, whether it's your house, your car, your physique, right? And it's like, why would that not apply to your company, right? Like, I mean, it's been shared a couple of times, even in this conversation. What got you to your first 10 million is now what brings you to your next 10 million. And you often think about that in terms of your team and the skill sets you have. But I would challenge everybody listening that it's similar, if not just as important, sometimes even more important, to think about your tech that way and making sure that it's all working seamlessly together and that it is advancing. Because at some point, and Rohan, I agree with everything you outlined too, of like, I think we're into the early majority. We're starting to get there. But at a certain point, candidates who apply and then wait multiple days to hear anything back, especially if they're a good fit for that role, they're not going to be enamored by the recruiter that reaches back out, right? Because they're starting to get used to a new normal. And so I think that's honestly something. I'm not one for fear tactics, but like there is something in that. Whereas the majority of the staffing industry starts to adopt this technology forward mindset. If your staffing firm isn't, you'll start to experience that rub on the other side because candidates come to expect it. So that actually brings us to, go ahead.
Say that we've actually now this year finally started to see folks coming into us. And that's one of their challenges, is that they actually have candidates that come to them and ask for that experience. And they've got competitors in market that have that experience. And so it's no longer about, it's no longer just about how do I make my business more efficient? It's how do I stop myself from losing business to my competitors? And that's becoming part of the conversation that I'm seeing the sales team having with our prospects. And so it is switching for sure. You're right. You're absolutely right.
And it starts out as like, I want this new shiny thing. to, I want it to create efficiencies, to, oh crap, everybody else is doing it. I need to start really thinking about it. And when you go to enough industry conferences over a couple of years, and probably if I ballparked, 60+% of the topics are around this kind of innovation, it's something to pay attention to. And that actually brings us into a really good just like conversation point around change management, technology adoption. How do you go from somebody in your company saw it at a conference, or you're aware that your competitors are using it, getting it bought into the company, to the entire company actually championing it and working together seamlessly to actually implement it? One thought I have on this, and Rowan and Danny, I would love to hear your thoughts too, is when someone invests in an MBA, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And there's no way they're just going to tuck that back somewhere in a file and never talk about it again. It's going to be prominent on their resume, prominent on their LinkedIn. It's a selling point of the skill set they have. And in conversations with, some industry favorites, Lauren Jones being one of them, unless you're using your technology as a differentiator and in conversations with your clients, with your candidates, with your recruiters, I think you're missing out on that opportunity. So, that tech adoption, change management comes in a lot of forms, but one is also celebrate it. It's an investment, and it's actually benefiting all parties. But what do you guys think about that?
I love that you said that. As a salesperson, you're tugging at my heartstrings. So how I go and talk about technology to our clients is our staffing partners. When they have their salespeople talking to HR departments of any size of company, one of your differentiators is your tech stack, right? It's the fact that you can go from job order to sourcing to submittal, hire, and onboarded in a matter of days, where your competition, who doesn't have as cohesive of a tech stack, it might take weeks to do that, right? So that's a weapon for you to use from a sales perspective, and you should be arming your salespeople with that knowledge and the understanding of your technology stack and why it's amazing and better than everyone else's. And I think that's a missed opportunity in staffing to tout your tech stack, because everyone in staffing has their own different secret sauce, but that doesn't mean that yours isn't any less special than someone else's. In a lot of cases, if you're listening to this podcast, you're aware, right, of tech stack, you're aware of digital staffing platforms is of interest. Chances are your tech stack's probably better than you realize, or better than the competition. So lead with it from a sales perspective.
Yeah, I'll share another story that's public from one of our customers. He was talking exactly about this, how their salespeople, when they go into a sales presentation right after one of their competitors, what they talk about, they ask the prospect, I'm going to guess that the person that came before me talked about the size of their database and how good the candidates are within their database. And then they talk about their funnel metrics. If you're looking for 100 positions, it's going to take my recruiters this amount of time to contact the people in the database, and then to go from contacting them to getting them through to actually getting them placed. And so they do that funnel math, and then they backwards it, and they say, okay, it's going to take us this amount of time to fill these roles. And what he was showing, and this is specifically in the hospitality space, what he was showing is that their salespeople, during the conversation with the prospect, are able to essentially put that order directly into their app and then broadcast it out while they're sitting across the table from that prospect. And during the course of their conversation, within the next 15, 20, 30 minutes, they've got 60 to 70% of those roles already filled, where people who are actually, in their database are seeing those positions pop up on their devices and opting in to those shifts. And so they say, we have the same funnel metrics as our competitors. The difference is that instead of going out and sourcing for the 100 positions that our competitor is going to, we've already got 60 to 70% filled in the time that we've been sitting across the table from you. And so we're only going to be looking at that funnel metrics as it applies to the remaining 30 to 40%. So we're going to be able to do that a lot faster. And then there's other things, they were able to consolidate their real estate footprint, and as a result of that, their operational expenses come down, and they're able to pass on those savings both to the client and to the candidate in the form of either lower bill rates or higher pay rates. And again, how does that change the experience for all of the different stakeholders in the equation? How much more is that client actually going to want to leverage that staffing agency if they know that it's going to be a lower markup than it has been in the past? And they can do that while still maintaining those higher gross margin dollars.
Man, and how amazing would that be to be, the client company sitting behind the desk, and all of a sudden the staffing firm person shows them, here, we've got people committed to these shifts already. Like, that's incredible.
Yeah,
that would never have happened before.
Yeah, that type of an experience is something that other staffing firms can't match, right? So think about that as being, your competitive differentiator, right? That could be a sales pitch and hiring, rep for Rex in the same meeting. So, which is pretty impressive.
Right. And again, just tying back to recruiter retention. Oh my gosh. I mean, that might even change comp structures in the industry. Like there's a lot of ripple effects to this. But I don't see a negative. Like I see that it helps the clients, the candidates, and the staffing firm. So it's really intriguing.
It is important how you communicate that change to the team. I think, Danny, you and I were chatting about this maybe the other day too, right? How you tell the folks on the team that why are you doing this, and how important is it? And hopefully they're starting to see that themselves, but certainly it's on the leadership team to take it to them and say, we've got competitors in the space that are doing this. That's one reason, but hopefully they're tying it back to what candidates and clients are expecting now, and how this is actually going to help them in their day-to-day role. So it is, I think, very crucial to communicate that why back to the team.
Right. And, everybody here in the US anyway, the UK is a different market with this approach, but everyone in the US seems to say, I fell into recruiting, like they didn't set out to get into it. They just found their way into it. And I remember having a conversation with Maurice Fuller a couple of years ago when these things were a bit more early in conversation to a lot of staffing firms. And I said, just the whole concept of AI and robotic process automation, all these pieces, do you think recruiters should be nervous? And he had a really, really interesting response that I back up wholeheartedly. And it's, nobody gets into recruiting hoping that they can spend more time sourcing and hoping that they can spend more time with like the day-to-day plug and play. They get into it because they care about people, and it's intriguing and exciting to be able to help make matches between careers and opportunities. And the idea with better tech adoption within your staffing firm is all centralized around getting your people to do the thing that they like the most and requires the most skill set to accomplish. So what can you automate that you don't need to be paying them to do? And it allows just more of their time to focus on the higher level components, and ultimately allows you to scale your company because of it.
Absolutely. I think in the earlier days of digital staffing and SPAS, it was, is this friend or foe? And the funny thing, Rohan, is that Monster 25 years ago, when we were created, agencies thought that we were going to be the death of them, right? Huh. They looked at us as competition, and they realized that, sure, a company that has one job to fill, we might win their business, but we're not strategically, partnering with companies that have 20,000 roles to fill in 10 different countries across multiple disciplines. Sometimes HR departments don't have the bandwidth to handle that, right? So we found our niche, right? Supporting staffing firms, not competing with them. But I think staffing platforms, are friend, right? They're not foe, especially not to recruiters. You mentioned, Kelly, before, you hire salespeople or recruiters because they're gregarious. They love people. They're good at having conversations. Yeah. You need one salesperson that, really enjoys data entry and right. calls and an ATS, and I'll call them crazy because they don't actually enjoy it, right? So let technology do the stuff that you don't like doing, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when you position it that way, by telling recruiters that they'll have more time for revenue generating opportunities and stuff that they actually like doing.
Right.
It's better for everyone. It's win-win. There's no losers in that situation.
No, it's so true. And when it comes down to you as a staffing firm saying, yep, we've got this platform, I'm just here listening to this fireside chat to see if there's any, nuggets of wisdom that the crew is sharing that I haven't thought of, or if you're a part of that majority and you're trying to determine what's next, what should I be investing in? The question comes up around buying versus building, and how do you approach that? What are the pros and cons? So I just want to spend a couple minutes on that and then share with everybody just a few key takeaways. But Rowan, can you share more? We've got a visual here around the buy versus build conversation, when it makes sense, when it doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, once you've wrapped your head around, okay, what is a staffing platform? Do I want it? Don't I want it? Then you've got really essentially three options to doing it, right? So you can, like you said, you can go out and create your own. You can acquire a company that's already got one. We've seen this happening a little bit more frequently. Actually, one of our customers just got acquired, and that's one way of bringing in the technology is acquiring someone that already has it. And then the third way is to find a staffing platform as a service provider and work with them. And the first and the third are the most expensive options, right? Acquiring a company, depending on the size of that company, the multiples that they're looking at, et cetera, that can be an expensive proposition. And you also have to look at, when you're acquiring that company, how did they get the technology? Did they build it themselves? And if they did, then you're kind of in that first bucket again, and we'll get into why. If they didn't, who do they get it from? What's the maintenance look like? And when you look at creating your own, the main benefit is that it's bespoke. You get to dictate exactly what you want, how you want that experience to look. And that's why I find a lot of, especially mid to large sized agencies, decide to go down this route, because they look at it and they say, we're at such a large size that we don't want to have the exact same experience as the agency down the road. And if we go and brand something out off the shelf, it's going to look exactly like our competitors. And that's certainly true for some SPaaS providers, but there are others that allow you to build on top of their platform and allow you to, really create an experience. And they've already got, for example, like the telemetry and all of the analytics behind the scenes that on the surface, you don't see those things. And so when you're creating your own, oftentimes you don't realize all of those things, because first you're just going out and trying to find, an industry expert. A lot of staffing agencies don't have the internal technical capability to build something. So they have to go out and find someone that's going to lead that team. And then hopefully that person is going to be able to build a team around them. We talked about the scarcity of recruiting talent. The scarcity of tech talent is, I don't know, I feel like that. I'm not recruiting recruiters. We recruit a lot of software engineers, and it is extremely difficult right now. Meta just announced, so we're in Toronto, and most of our engineers are across Canada. We've got a couple of folks in the US. Meta just announced a couple of weeks ago that they're going to be hiring 2,500 engineers in the Toronto area.
Oh my gosh. And you're like, great.
Yeah, exactly. So, so it's the aspiration of trying to build a team. First, you have to find that talent. Then you have to get that talent to work together. And you have to make sure, and then it's, you have to give them time, because they have to come in, they have to understand the problems that you're looking to solve and how they're going to actually go about solving that. I think, Danny, you and I were talking about that, right? Like that larger agency that's in that $1 billion mark, they actually went out and found someone, and to their credit, not the typical experience. Because once you hire that person to build a team, that's their mandate. They're going to index for that first, more often than looking at the problem and saying, well, this is actually a solved problem, and I think it's actually best for us to go out and license technology off of the shelf. If you're getting a builders get excited by building. So they're not going to want to license something else. They're going to want to try and build it. And so as an agency, you have to look at what is the time to market, the opportunity cost of the 12 to 18 to realistically 24 months of opportunity cost by the time I get not just an MVP, not just something that, says, okay, I've got a mobile app, I can put this on my website and say that I have a mobile app. No, something that's actually going to add value to, again, those candidates. It's going to take time because you're going to have to constantly iterate. And then the other part of it is it's not a one and done. Like once you've got this product built, it's something that you're going to have to constantly keep evolving, because those expectations that you were talking about, Danny and Kelly, like those expectations are constantly changing. And so you constantly have to keep, upkeep on that. And it's extremely challenging. So
that's a similar concept to a company hiring a staffing firm for their rapidly advancing hiring needs, rather than trying to always do it in-house. And I think there are scenarios where building makes sense. It seems like just through conversations over the last few years with multiple people in the industry that buying, like if it already exists, it's something worth checking out, right?
Yeah, I think people have to realize you can build your own house, but you wouldn't, right? Because it would take you 20 years to do something that a professional builder could do in 6 months or a year. So just because you can doesn't mean you always should. And I think it's important to remember your core competencies as an agency. If you've built your own homegrown applicant tracking system, you probably have a leg up on other organizations, and maybe you should consider the build versus buy scenario. Because you've got experience hiring software engineers, you've had experience supporting something after you've initially built it. But if you don't have a large internal IT organization, if you don't have experience hiring software engineers, it's something that could be really challenging. So don't fool yourself into thinking you can do something you've never done before easily. And at least kick the tires on a handful of the vendors that are out there that do offer SPaaS as a platform. So I think that's important.
Rohan, I'm going to agree and disagree at the same time, Danny. Yeah. So I agree with you. If they built an ATS, they certainly have a leg up on that build, and they've got some experience. But it's different though, right? When you're building an ATS, you're building for your internal stakeholders, and you can mandate that they have to use the platform. If you're building an SPaaS, you're building for external stakeholders, you're building for your clients and your candidates. You can't force adoption on them as easily as you can your internal stakeholders. And that's where the experience of someone that actually has done this before and has seen the challenges, I think is even more critical. And of course, it's a bit self-serving for me to say that. So I'll own that. And that's why I say, I agree and I disagree. But you're building, it's not just a web application that you're building mobile applications. And typically that means for most people, 3 different dev teams, because you have to have an Android, an iOS, and a web team. And so take whatever experience you had building that ATS, multiply it by 3, probably a bit more than that. And then see how shiny your head wants to be at the end of that experience.
And I agree, Rohan. I'm not saying everyone that's built their own ATS can or should, but it at least shows that they've had some experience doing something like that in the past. So they should, consider both options. We worked with a staffing firm recently. We were doing a technology audit of their entire tech stack. And we uncovered staffing platforms as a potential opportunity for them to look into. So they looked at buying versus building, and they ran through a cost analysis on it. And what they initially thought was just hiring a software or an app developer spiraled into hiring multiple developers, hiring a support team, right? Bringing in subject matter experts that have done stuff like this before in the past, that have worked with and integrated with different ATS platforms. And it quickly went from a 6-figure build to a multiple 7-figure build. And then that's for the initial build out. And it went from a 6-month projected timeline to a 2-year projected timeline. So they quickly realized that, although they could, they should look at other options as well.
Man, as you guys can tell, we could chat about this buy versus build concept for a long time. Like there's so much here. So by way of the last few minutes, I want to spend really kind of getting some cool thoughts out of Danny's head and Rohan's head around what a framework looks like, for really just your overall technology adoption process. I mean, there's a lot of different models out here, but Danny, I'm going to share a visual here that you've provided to me, and I'll go ahead and populate everything. You want to speak to this? Just like, what is this? How is this helpful to people that you talk to?
Yeah, sure. Monster created this a couple of years ago as a guide to help us understand our clients' technology stacks a little bit better. A lot of the times Monster, was looked at as a source of candidates, and we would just throw a bunch of candidates over the wall to our staffing partners. And we hoped that, the right recruiter got them and submitted them to the right job. But we realized we needed to be more thoughtful with understanding what happens after we give a candidate to a client of ours. Because everyone has a different process, everyone has a different tech stack. So it's really important that we understand holistically their entire process. So we've built what's called the Staffing Infinity Loop. And on the left side of the loop, it shows the recruiter experience and all of the different technologies that you could have or should have for recruiters to use. An order originates in the applicant tracking system, right? Once you have that order, how do you distribute that to your recruiters and account managers? Is it manual? Can it be uploaded into a digital staffing platform like TempSaved? Once it's published and alive in your world, right? Where does it go? Can it go to a website or a career page that you've built, right? How do you rewrite your amazing job descriptions that you just got from your client that are perfect and don't need any editing whatsoever, right? So there's all of these different steps that have to happen seamlessly, with the recruiter not realizing, one technology is handshaking another technology. And then on the right-hand side of the Staffing Infinity Loop, we have the candidate experience, right? What happens once they get an offer? How do you make them feel warm and fuzzy while they're on assignment? And then, I think the largest issue that's in the industry right now is how do we help them find their next opportunity with our organization? One of the biggest complaints we get from our staffing partners is that, we reinvent the wheel every single time we get a new job order. We have 1,000 people on assignment right now, and 100 of them end up coming back to us for their next assignment. So that's, a huge opportunity for them, right? To capitalize on those candidates that are contractors that they're losing to other staffing firms or other, direct hire type opportunities. So we use this as a guide, and we facilitate this conversation. We call it a technology audit. And as an agnostic partner, we can help say, maybe you should consider digital staffing platforms, right? And here are the ones that we've worked with and seen in the past that you should consider looking at. And, maybe you do need a better website, right? Maybe you do need better copy and an analysis of your brand, and you need to contact Parka for that, right? So there's all these different vendors that make up your tech stack. And tying it back to something we talked about earlier is, how do we use technology as a sales tool? Imagine if you could fill in all of these points on the Staffing Infinity Loop and go into your client and show them the digital staffing platform, how it fills orders for them in real time. Imagine being able to say, this document that I have, this living and breathing document, helps us get from job order to fill in 24 hours or 48 hours. So this is something that I think is so important to do. And, staffing firms don't often get all of the different stakeholders in their business in the same room at the same time, right? On this sheet, we have background check technology. We have HRIS and time cards. We have websites and job postings. Those are all different people that make those decisions in your organization. And they don't realize that, maybe their technology decision on product A needs to tie back to product decision B in another part of the process. So it's a fun engagement to go through and figure out, hey, we crush it in this area. We have an amazing website. We have an amazing, matching technology and chatbot technology, but we have a terrible background check provider, right? That's a huge gap there that we need to fill. So there's no better time to, reevaluate or evaluate your tech stack than today.
Yeah. And I love this visual, when you shared this with me just in conversation and sent it over, everybody listening to this just needs to see it. It's just a good gut check of where are these places coming together? How does it work seamlessly for the candidates and for our team? It's fun to watch companies, especially some of the larger companies, staffing firms, invest in heads of talent technology. Advanced Group hired Kate Rutherford, just as an example, she is essentially determining, all right, how is their alignment between marketing and recruiting and technology, and just kind of like, how does this sing together without having everything be completely siloed? And I'm starting to see more and more companies do that. And I get really excited around like the nurturing piece. Okay, so you've got people out on deployment, you want to send them out on contract again, you've got the right tech, but do you have the right messaging? Do you have, how is that nurturing cadence set up? And those are the things that I get really nerdy and excited about. But Danny, thank you for sharing this. And Rowan, I wanted to just spend a couple minutes here as well on when you start thinking about an SPaaS or, staffing platform as a service model, what kinds of things go into that people should just be thinking about?
Yeah, at the surface, a lot of folks look at this and say, well, I need an app, and that's where they start out. And so oftentimes, when you look at the players that are winning, what I would say to folks is, go out and look at, there's no longer a shortage of folks that are actually doing this. And so, if you're surrounding yourself with other staffing agency owners who haven't adopted something like this, maybe go outside of that comfort zone and look at someone who actually has, and try to understand how has that impacted their business, and then start looking at, what are some of these pieces? And most SPaaS providers, ourselves included, aren't necessarily building every single piece. But the key difference is that we're not looking at creating integrations. A lot of times we embed different softwares into our platform. And the difference there is even just the experience for that internal team, that recruiting team, not having to worry about, does this integration work the way it should? And then what does that experience look like for the external stakeholders? So can my candidates see their pay stubs on the app? Can they do everything on that app, from finding that job, signing up, going through the onboarding, messaging that recruiter, and submitting their timesheets, seeing all their shifts, and having it so that they can do all of that in one place? And the same thing with the end client. How do we create that sort of seamless experience for that end client as well? So, components of it are in here. And one of the key things that we find has been really impactful over the last little while, especially during this candidate shortage, is that referral module, essentially creating a virality within your network, your candidate network. If you are creating that really good experience that's differentiated from your competitors, they're probably going to tell their friends about it. And you should encourage them and reward them for doing that.
Yeah, no, it's just so cool to see all in one place. I know in the staffing industry, we hear all of these different pieces, but to see how they can come together is really impactful. And if this were a live webinar, I would be saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your staffing firm's platformification? Like, how are you thinking about it? Would you give yourselves like a 1, or would you give yourself a 9? I know we don't have that option, but think about that, right? Like just take that to heart and process, where do I need to be investing in a buy or a build, or just starting to explore?
We've come a long way since 1481, when Leonardo da Vinci invented the resume. You would be proud of where you've taken the industry, Rowan.
Well, and just as go ahead, Ro. What?
No. I was like, thanks, Danny, but I can't take credit for.
Oh, this is good. This is good. Well, on that note, these fireside chats are really intended to be nerdy conversations that I'm having with innovators in the staffing industry, and inviting people like yourself to come alongside and hear them. They're never intended to be a sales conversation, right? This is what are the cool things happening? How can we nerd out and talk about it? When I was chatting with these guys ahead of the call, I saw a really cool case study that brings all of this together. And so I actually asked Rowan if he would share it. So Ro, can you just talk through one example of a company that went through this process and how it impacted them? Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of levers to pull, but they particularly pulled the lever of partnering with you guys. And what did it do?
Yeah, so I think Aram, the CEO here, he was the one that helped us put these together. And what was interesting was their entire approach. They brought in 17 different folks from their organization into a boardroom, and went through the process of evaluating different vendors. And so they looked at the different SPaaS providers, and it started there. It was, this is why we're going to do this. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to evaluate these different, and this is what we expect at the end. And they'd set some goals as a result of those expectations. They wanted, for example, one of their goals was to get 80% of their deployed candidate pool to download the app within that first 2 months. And they actually found that.
Can we just pause on that? Like 80% of their candidate pool to download the app. Like that. I feel like if someone threw out that potential KPI in a meeting, like half people would have fallen off their chairs. So I just want to, I don't know where you're going with this.
They hit 700% to that goal within that time frame. And again, it just speaks to the experience that you can create here, right? If you can actually create that experience that the candidates want, it does become it does introduce some virality in there. And then when you look at what does that have in terms of downstream effects? Well, the biggest one is the revenue increase, right? So they were actually able to increase the revenue in that division by 30% within that time frame. And by removing the placement, so the placement streamlining was actually interesting. What they were doing, so the recruiters were having conversations with their candidates, and they're picking up the phone and they're saying, "Hey, Kelly, tell me about where you want to work and when you want to work and what your specialties are and all of those types of things." And then, being good recruiters, they would, if the candidate said, "Well, I want to look at positions in New York," they would only show them positions in New York, and these are travel nurses. What happened when they actually moved to the app was they changed the conversation. They said, go into the app, you're going to see the exact same positions that I'm seeing. We want to be very transparent with you. And so you're going to see all the pay packages and the everything in there. And what ended up happening that was interesting is that those same candidates were now opting into positions in California and Florida, and things that they wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to if the recruiter had just been doing what the candidate had asked for. And so it exposes that difference in that people don't always act on the way that they tell us that they're going to act, and we can actually look at their behavior and adapt accordingly. And the recruiter time saved one was a big one, for the recruiters that had been in the organization for a very long time, that had their processes, they saved a bit of time. It was about 15%. But for the ones that had been there, that had just started at the beginning of COVID and were, basically launching onto a platform like this, they got to their annual targets in half the time that recruiters that didn't leverage this technology previously had. And so you think about that, right? If I'm bringing in new recruiters, what's their experience look like? And how does that impact my ability to recruit other recruiters to be able to say, well, if you go and work for, the agency down the street, it's going to take you this amount of time in order to hit your earning targets, and you can do it in half the time here. And we've actually got metrics that can show you can do that, right? So a lot of different wins that can be looked at for something like this, and just goes to show that the impact can be had in many different ways depending on what you want to measure.
No, thanks for sharing that, Rowan. I know it's one of those things where there's a lot of technologies you can focus on in the industry, but just this concept of platformification, it can go a long way. It touches a lot of areas. So we've talked about a lot of different things here, covered a lot of ground, right? Candidate, client, recruiter impact, technology adoption. So I want to round it out and leave you guys with any thoughts. I know one of the pieces that we had all chatted about before we hit record was there's a really great podcast out there called You Own the Experience with Lauren Jones and Rob Mann. And I'm sure if you are on this fireside chat, you're probably familiar with that as well. They do a really nice job of talking about just the new things happening from an innovative standpoint in the staffing industry. But Danny and Rowan, are there any other resources that you'd like to point people to as they'd like to learn more about just anything happening innovation-wise in our industry?
Yeah, I would say have the conversation, right? You mentioned that some organizations have heads of talent technology. For those that don't, there are consulting firms and agencies out there that have come about over the past few years. You mentioned a couple of them today that specialize in just that. So bring them in, evaluate your technology stack, use the Staffing Infinity Loop document that I shared before to just start having the conversation about what does my tech stack look like today. A lot of times we kick the can down the road saying, oh, I'm so far behind. And it acts as like a barrier for you to evaluate and look in the mirror. but there's no better time, I said this before, to start evaluating your technology stack than today, and leverage the resources, right, that are available, whether it's ASA or SIA, the live conferences, that are happening. There's many events. There was one earlier today on LinkedIn held by another provider in the space about, automation and technology. So leverage all the resources that you can out there, whether they're free or paid. But, just take that first step in evaluating it.
I mean, if you're watching this podcast, have a chat with Kelly and pick her brain. Have a chat with Danny, pick her brain. Have a chat with me. I think there's a lot of blogs you can get out, go out there and read now from all the different staffing providers. SI has got a list of, so Staffing Industry Analyst has a list of the different players, because not everyone's going to be a good fit for everyone. So, who's going to be the best fit for you? And if you've got that list, then you can go down and you can actually, do some reading on your own time, learning on your own time, and then figure out, what it is. But it's just like, going to the gym, eating healthy, all these things. Like every change you want to make, you got to start with one little step. So what does that one little step look like? Start there, and don't think of it as a daunting change. It can be massive, but the impact can be massive. But it just starts with that. How do I seek out some information? So great advice.
I love that. And if it's if you're in Bullhorn, check out Bullhorn Marketplace. There's a lot of content that they're partners are sharing as well. SIA, ASA have been mentioned. There's so many good resources out there. And so, maybe we'll just take it one step further and every week consume something, whether it's a podcast, a webinar on demand, whatever it is, like try to learn and just like take that in, because the industry is not slowing down and we're all just along for the ride and making it happen just like you are. So thank you everyone so much for joining this fireside chat today about the platformification of staffing. Danny, Rowan, I really appreciate you guys being here. And we're all on LinkedIn. If you guys ever wanted to chat further about this topic, I'm sure you'll see us at all the upcoming conferences, all that fun jazz. So thank you guys, and we'll see everybody on the next one.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.